All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Kinseth. I am the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum. Since 2010, the Meadows Museum has provided aspiring art professionals with intensive scholarly and international experiences through fellowships in the museum's curatorial department. We are pleased to welcome, through the gracious support of the Center for Spain in America, the museum's first CSA Predoctoral Curatorial Fellow, Akemi Herráez Vossbrink. And we're thrilled to offer all of you the opportunity to get to know her today and her scholarship. We're joined by Dr. Amanda Dotsift, the curator here at the Meadows Museum. She holds a PhD in medieval art and architecture from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and among the many fellowships she's held, included is a curatorial fellowship here at the Meadows Museum. So with that, I am very pleased to hand the program over to Dr. Amanda Dotsift.
Good morning to everyone. I am so glad you could join us today, and I am absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce you to our new CSA fellow, Akemi Luisa, Herráez Vossbrink. We're delighted to have her here in Dallas. Maybe she'll tell us about some of the complications it took to get here during the COVIDs. But I think, even though we're all in our offices here with the doors closed, we're so happy to be able to continue this very important fellowship program. Akemi has a wonderfully international CV and professional career. She did her BA at Cambridge University in the UK. She got an MA also in art history at the University of Edinburgh and is currently a PhD candidate also at Cambridge. Her thesis deals with the reception of the Golden Age artist Francisco de Zurbarán in Latin America, and specifically in Peru and Mexico. And I'm hoping she'll tell us a little bit more about that in a minute. She's held a number of grants and fellowships, perhaps most notably in the paintings department at the Getty in LA. And she comes to us from a curatorial fellowship at the National Gallery of Art in London, where she worked on two absolutely fabulous exhibitions. I can say that with full confidence because I was able to see them. One was Bartolomé Bermejo, Master of the Spanish Renaissance, and the other was Sorolla, Spanish Master of Light. So it is with great pleasure I welcome Akemi to the Meadows, and I figured I'd start just by quizzing her. We're all getting to know our wonderful new curatorial department member here, and so I just thought, Akemi, maybe I'd ask the obvious question, which is, what spurred your interest in Spanish art?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Amanda and Ann. Well, basically, I was born in Madrid, and I grew up basically very close to the Prado Museum. So I was constantly exposed to the masterpieces by Golden Age Spanish masters. I guess interestingly, moving to the UK kind of made me realize how much I miss those Spanish masters. And I really love visiting collections such as the National Gallery or the Wallace Collection or Dulwich in London, which have wonderful Spanish art collections. And one of my highlights per se has always been Francisco de Zurbarán, especially his portraits of female saints. There's stunning renditions, and there's some at the Prado Museum, but there's also a beautiful one of St. Margaret, for example, at the National Gallery in London. And in a way, Spanish art has always been an interest of mine. And even when I went to Los Angeles at the Getty Museum, I had the chance to admire Spanish masterpieces, but also that acquainted me with Latin American art. So that's where my interest in combining Spanish and Latin American art originated.
I love that. Growing up a stone's throw from the Prado, it reminds me, of course, of the story of our founder, Algar H. Meadows, and his wife, Virginia Meadows, who fell in love with Spanish art precisely because they were staying at the Ritz for business reasons. And there's something about exposure to the real thing that just gets under your skin.
Exactly.
So I was also wondering, just thinking about such an international background you have with kind of major European capitals, is there anything particular you're looking forward to learning about here in Texas?
I think Texas is very interesting because it has this multicultural past. It has a very strong very strong collections of Spanish art, not only in Dallas, but also in Houston, San Antonio, Austin. I'm very much looking forward to visiting those collections. And I'm also quite interested in going to San Antonio and seeing the missions around there.
Yes. Yeah, the missions are amazing. Yeah. They really, I grew up near a mission as well, but what's fascinating to me about the ones in San Antonio is that the entire kind of mission complex is intact. So I think you get a really good idea of how they worked, sort of as a complex, not just as a single building. So I love that you've got some great coverage of the whole state here. So let's kind of bring it back home. And is there anything in particular you're looking forward to working on here at the Meadows or about being at the Meadows?
I think what will be very interesting for me is I've mostly been working with paintings because at the Getty Museum, I was at the paintings department, and at the National Gallery is exclusively a paintings collection, although they do have some pastels and other mediums. But what is interesting for me is going to be able to fluctuate periods, which I love. I mean, at the National Gallery, I already worked on the 15th and 20th century. So I hope to explore other periods as well, maybe even more modern and contemporary if possible, because my training is more in the Spanish Golden Age. And I would be very curious to work more on drawings, on prints, on sculpture, on decorative arts. These areas I haven't studied as much and would be fascinating to learn alongside the curators and hopefully help out with some of the exhibitions such as Berruguete that I cannot wait to see actually.
Which you'll get to see on Monday, right? So Akemi's first day for all of you, her first official day is Monday. And so I don't think you've been in the museum yet, right?
No, I haven't.
And have you ever visited the Meadows?
No, I haven't been to Texas, so this is all new for me, actually.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. Well, we're so glad you could come, especially in these like strange COVID times. So just some other kind of maybe fun questions, and then maybe we'll open it up to our guests who may have more kind of scholarly questions to ask you. But I was just curious, what are you reading right now?
Do you mean in terms of academically or for pleasure?
So she's finishing her thesis. We all know you're reading plenty academic things, but what are you reading for fun?
For fun, actually, maybe it's a bit pessimistic for this time, but I guess you have to know about the times. The name of the book is Albert Camus' La Peste.
Yes.
That deals with the plague, and it's set in Algeria, and it talks about this town that gets affected by the plague with how the country evolves, and I mean how the city evolves. Oran is a city chosen, and how they deal with lockdown, and how a doctor who is kind of the star of the book kind of goes through different phases of how to deal with patients, empathy, how to deal with certain family relations. So this is very much pertinent to our times. So I thought it would be a good read for now.
Yes, it is. I think I had Death in Venice on my reading list early on. Equally pessimistic, but any new hobbies you've picked up during the COVIDs?
Well, not as much as picked up a new hobby, but I've kind of restarted a hobby that I kind of left aside for a while. I'm very interested in drawings and pastels especially, and thankfully, thanks to a group of friends of mine, every Sunday we meet for a couple hours and we choose a theme to focus on, and we all get our pastel kits and our pencils, and we get on working, and I've been very much focusing on my pets in Spain. So my animal drawing skills.
Yes, yes. I love that. I love a good experimental art historian. It's good to get your hands dirty sometimes, isn't it?
Exactly.
So I wonder, maybe I'll ask you just, since we had the fun stuff, maybe I'll ask you one sort of more serious question about your research, and then perhaps we can open it up to the group. So, you know, this is something that we always have to deal with as PhD students, in that we have to have our elevator pitch, right, for the thesis. So what's your thesis elevator pitch? Why should we all, as soon as you're finished with it, be downloading it and reading it cover to cover?
I think what I want to really emphasize with Zurbarán in Latin America is that even if there has been a lot of emphasis, especially on Zurbarán's relation to Mexico, I think this was even stronger with South America, especially Peru, where he did have like connections. He had merchants that he knew that were actively involved, especially in the capital, which was Lima. There are a corpus of paintings by him, but mostly him and his workshop, or his workshop. And what is interesting about them is how then the local painters readapted and reinterpreted these paintings, and how you can find them in the most remote towns in Peru, Bolivia, even Colombia. I've seen some reinterpretations. So, and many of them you have to go and see in person. They're not even good photographs of these. So it was kind of a rediscovery of series that were just briefly cited in books, let's say, and I had to go and see in person to validate these interpretations. And the other interesting factor is that I've found some archival material as well in Peru about collectors, especially in the 17th and 18th century, that were said to own paintings by Zurbarán. We don't know if they were actually by Zurbarán, because unfortunately they haven't come down to us. But it's very exciting to see that they're mentioned by name, these artists. So there was a certain recognition of who this artist was. It's true that it was mostly amongst prominent religious figures and nobility, but at least this shows us that Zurbarán was not an anonymous figure, but very much recognized in that.
His name had a certain cachet, and
exactly.
And his, it sounds like his style perhaps was kind of broadly recognizable. For those of you who don't know, Akemi contributed a wonderful essay to the catalog that accompanied the Zurbarán exhibition we had here at the Meadows a few years ago. And it precisely on this connection between his workshop and his work in Spain and in the Americas, and sort of this kind of dealing with issues of reception and this sort of thing. So shall we open it up to some more questions? Does anyone have any questions for Akemi?
Okay, so Akemi, we have a question. It's a long one, or longer. So just, we have Andrena. I apologize about the pronunciation. Just saying it's a pleasure to meet you. And it sounds like she herself is Peruvian and is excited about hearing you talk about Peru and Latin American art. So she is an art student at the School of the Arts here at SMU at the Meadows School right now. And she's interested in possibly pursuing curation as a career. And she's wondering if you have any tips in regards to pursuing that career, and kind of anything you would recommend about studies or kind of internships.
Thank you very much for your question. So yes, I think the best advice is to be quite flexible about where you move and how you advance. For example, I would strongly recommend, if you're interested in curatorial careers, to look at fellowships and internships, because those, I think, will really put you at the forefront more so than doing a master's. Obviously, it is important to study academically art history, a BA, master's level, and even PhD. But most importantly is where you do your internships and volunteering. For example, I started off just going 1 month to the Prado Museum and work with the Friends Association, just selling gallery guides and memberships. And this actually was the opportunity to then apply for the Getty internship in Los Angeles. So you can start with small things, more like memberships, and starting in stores and the museums. And this will acquaint you at least with the essentials in the museum. You will get to meet people. And then you can do the next step, which is an internship, and you start working more directly with curators, deal with loans. And then there's the other step, which is further on along your career. You can go and do fellowships, such as the ones at the Meadows, if you're interested in Spanish art. But there are also, if you're interested in Latin America, many opportunities in the United States, especially on Latin American colonial and modern and contemporary art, if you're curious about that. I also would encourage you to give talks and be very vocal and try socializing skills, because they're very important when you're a curator. You have to be very much in control of your material, and you attain that by giving lectures, if you can, organizing seminars, being very proactive and outspoken. And because it is very important to develop your archival and research skills, but you also have to have those communication skills that are essential for curators.
Thank you so much, Akemi. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions before we transition to a presentation that Akemi has prepared on a work in the Meadows Museum collection. So Yolanda is interested in Zurbaran and your interest in Zurbaran. Can you speak more about what you admire about that artist?
Yes, indeed. I think what I most admire is how he can render fabrics. That probably comes from his father. There was a textile merchant of Basque origin. And it's incredible, like there are treatises like Pacheco, who wrote about several Golden Age Spanish masters, who said, for example, that Zurbaran would get mannequins and dress them to closely study the folds of the draperies, no? And apart from this textiles, I really admire how he captures the theatrical nature of paintings, especially with his painting series, where you see several, let's say, female saints, apostles, or tribes of Israel, as we saw at the Meadows Museum, in procession, no? And they kind of also hint towards Baroque theatricality, the kind of religious festivities, how they were positioned in the naves of the churches. Many times they were kind of on enfilade at the top of the nave, processing towards the altar. So in a way, you got this continuity between the interior spaces with these processing figures in the canvases and the processions that were happening outdoors. There's, for example, a wonderful painting I recommend that encapsulates this in Seville, in the cathedral, where they're celebrating this, the festivities of the Immaculate Conception, and you have this procession and this backdrop of textiles with paintings of archangels, saints, apostles. So I think those are the two main features that really captivate me in his work.
Thank you so much. So we have one final question before we'll invite you to share your screen and share your presentation, Akemi. So Maria Teresa is also from Peru, and she is wondering if you have actually been to Peru to see the works yourself.
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate because I had several scholarships that allowed me to travel to Peru, and I was even there living for 3 months. I was living in Lima for 3 months, and it was very exciting. I was able to not only work in the archive, but I went to most of the convents and gain access thanks to very generous friends that gave me those opportunities. Then apart from that, I was able to travel widely around, especially the south of Peru. I went to Cusco and the towns around it, and down to Lake Titicaca, and then down to Bolivia as well. There was a lot of interesting material in Bolivia. And it was fascinating. It's a territory full of things to discover. I mean, Mexico is enthralling, but I think in terms of Peru, for Zurbarán's work, it's a gold mine in a way, because there's much less done and much less digitalized, because most of the paintings are actually in religious orders or in churches. So they're not accessible as they are in Mexico, where there's a great corpus of them. And apart from religious orders, there are also many in the Mexico City's collections. So that for me was the true highlight in Peru.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think we're gonna now transition to the second part of this program. Akemi, just so you know, your Wi-Fi, I think, is getting a little patchy. I don't know if there's adjustments that you know that work, but I will invite you now to go ahead and share your screen. Akemi does that just as a reminder to everyone else that throughout this presentation, you can continue to use the chat function to address questions you have that we'll hold till the end.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the patchy internet. If there's any moment where you struggle to understand what I'm saying, please get in touch. I don't know how to solve it exactly, but I can repeat things if needed. Please send me a message or let me know, okay? Thank you very much.
Great.
Now I would like to share my presentation of my favorite painting in the collection. I hope all of you can see it. So my favorite painting in the collection, as I mentioned, I'm quite an animal lover. So the portrait of Juan Carreno de Mirandas of the dwarf Micol was especially appealing. Painted between 1670 and 1682. And what I find most spectacular, and for me what is most striking, is the representation of the cactus held by Micol, which for me represent and encapsulate the Spanish Empire's interest in exotic creatures, and also signify how the Spanish viceroyalties overseas at this time expanded from Latin America to the Philippines, no? So they encapsulate this exotic feature there. And what I find interesting is also Micol, who was a jester in the Spanish King Charles II's court. And he would have been, or could have been, the caretaker for the animals in Madrid's palace. This is quite likely, seeing that he's surrounded by animals, no? Before discussing Micol in detail, I would like to outline a bit Carreno de Miranda's career, so you familiarize yourself with his life, especially those years when he was a royal painter. So Juan Carreno de Miranda was born in Avilés, Asturias, Spain, in the north of Spain, in 1614. Juan Carreno de Miranda is actually one of the lesser known Spanish Golden Age masters, mostly active in the mid to late 17th century. Most of his training took place in Madrid in the workshops of the local artists, Pedro de Cuevas and Bartolomé Román. After his training, he mostly completed local commissions for religious institutions, aristocratic families, and he learned the fresco painting technique. There is also a vast corpus of drawings by him, which were often points of reference and were shown to patrons as initial models. In 1669, Queen Mariana of Austria of Spain, acting as regent to the future the Spanish King Charles II, hired Carreno as court painter and shortly after promoted him to painter of the bedchamber in the royal court based in Madrid at the time. And he succeeded an incredible lineage of court painters such as Diego Velazquez, Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo, and Sebastián Herrera Barnuevo. And the latter two artists that are lesser known had been painters of the bedchamber between 1664 and 1671, as they had passed away shortly after being granted the status, whereas Carreno was active for an extended period from 1671 until his death in 1685. Carreno portrayed the Spanish King Charles II on numerous occasions as a young boy and as a monarch. Carreno did not hide the monarch's sickly countenance, as he was born out of a marriage between King Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria. Such consanguinity resulted in his weak musculature, infertility, and his jaw was so pronounced that he struggled to speak until the age of 4. Such was his condition that he was nicknamed El Hechizado, the bewitched. Carreno disguised the monarch's frail condition by capturing the sumptuous palatial settings and masterfully rendering fabrics, as we see in this example. And of course, we see the lavish kind of interior decorations, such as the console table that actually exists at the Prado Museum. You can see it. And then you see the incredible frames with the Habsburg eagle, no? The vivid colors also chosen and the kind of the palette and the very free, loose brushstrokes also remind us of Venetian artists such as Titian, which he could have seen in the Spanish court at the time, or also Flemish masters also present in the Spanish court collection, such as paintings by Rubens and Van Dyck. Carreno also painted portraits of Charles II's mother, Mariana of Austria, and these were often conceived as pendants to portraits of Charles II. Here we see her as a widow already after the passing of her husband, King Philip IV, and she was Queen Regent until her son, Charles II, was old enough to reign. During this period, Carreno also portrayed court jesters, ambassadors, and dukes wearing lavish clothing. Micol was painted during this late period of Carreno's career, during which he had attained the most elevated status as court painter. Michel Paul, otherwise known as Miso, was born in Italy and joined the court of Charles II in Madrid in the 1670s. Michel was not an exception in the Spanish court, as between 1563 and 1700, there had been a total of 123 people of small and short stature in the Spanish court. Throughout this talk, I would like to refer to Micol as a dwarf, a buffoon, or a jester, which were the historical terms used at the time. Although I must emphasize that these are outdated and these are inappropriate nowadays, but in the historical context, they were named in this fashion. So I'm not using them at all in a derogatory fashion. So these jesters were highly esteemed, and they were often appointed as playmates to young princes and princesses, as demonstrated in Diego Velázquez's royal portrait Las Meninas. For example, we see Nicolás Pertusato at the very right, nudging the mastiff that's trying to calmly have his siesta, a nap. And then next to him is Maria Barbola. And they often accompanied the little Margarita around the court, no? And the other princesses, which were called las meninas, which is the Portuguese term for the princesses, no, the little princesses. Also, dwarfs in this time were also given the privilege of attending royal ceremonies, such as the auto de fe, or rituals of public penances for condemned heretics and apostates. Here we see a painting by Francisco de Rizzi, where he portrays the royal couple in this podium observing the trials, and they're accompanied by 3 dwarfs. I'm sorry for the quality, but I couldn't get a higher resolution kind of image of this scene. And one of them perhaps could have been Micol, actually. I must say though, and emphasize that not all of this was a glorious story for dwarfs and jesters. Many of them actually were taken from hospitals for the insane. And they were then appointed to the Spanish court. In a way, they were freeing them from that milieu. But the problem is, if they did not adapt to the court life, they were often sent back to these hospitals. So it was not all perfect for them. So going back to Micol's portrait, in 1686, it was actually recorded in Madrid's Royal Palace inventory is a portrait of Micol with 2 white birds, 2 little dogs, and some fruits. It measured 1.5 meters in height, which is roughly less than 1.5 meters, without a frame, and originated by the hand of Carreno. The inventory also included another dwarf portrait attributed to Carreno. The sitter was Nicholas Hudson, an English dwarf whose portrait, now unfortunately lost, was the same size as that of Micol. Micol stares at us with a melancholic expression while holding a cockatoo displaying its full plumage. Whereas his expression is detailed, his doublet, lace, collar, cuffs, and hands are hastily painted, appearing as white highlights against his black outfit. His hair was long and loose, following the court fashion represented in portraits by King Charles II. The number of animals depicted suggests that he was indeed the court animal caretaker. The 2 cockatoos are placed next to Micol, enhancing his small stature. He is also accompanied by 2 dogs, 3 goldfinches, and a still life featuring pomegranates and grapes. He appears to be in a fictive court setting with a disproportionate pedestal leading towards the gardens. Carreno loosely paints a sunset in the manner of Venetian masters. This is offset by the angularity of the gray architecture, which is enlivened by the colorful animals and fruits. Okay, now I would like to focus on the cockatoos. As I said, they were my favorite feature in this painting. Because they serve several functions actually in these kind of portraits. They showcase the extent of the Spanish Empire, the royal wealth, and the diverse animals found in the palace's menagerie. In the late 17th century, most of these exotic animals were kept in Madrid's palace of the Buen Retiro. Actually, if you go to the Buen Retiro Park nowadays, you might see that there's still like indications of the enclosures where animals were, because this was still used as a zoo until the 19th century. So there's an area actually called the bear pit and everything. So you can even picture nowadays what it is. Unfortunately, the palace that was next to the Buen Retiro Park is now gone. So these exotic birds were quite interesting because they were much easier and lighter to transport overseas than other animals such as lions or giraffes, for example. Imagine bringing those overseas. And they were often kept in enormous cages in the palatial gardens. But some of the most prized birds were also kept in smaller, elaborate cages in the residential quarters. Such birds had exceptional beauty and singing skills. They even had a music instructor who would teach them how to sing. The two cockatoos might have been kept indoors and taught to mimic words and tunes, although their imitation skills probably did not adapt fast enough to save their life. According to an anecdote by Madame d'Aulnoy, and this belonged to Charles II's wife, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, who, I quote, brought them from France and loves them dearly. The elderly Duchess of Terranova thought that it was best to kill them as they only spoke French, apparently. This seems to have been the sad destiny of these cockatoos, as the queen seems to have grieved their loss. Or perhaps they died of old age, but you have to consider that cockatoos and parrots live long lives, so we don't know exactly. This is all anecdotal, but I thought it was interesting to share. But perhaps these birds were chattier than usual, as parrots and cockatoos were sometimes even given wine to incite them to talk. Here we see an example of this act in John Steen's Dutch street scene, which draws on popular proverbs and puns. Don't try this at home, just saying. So another challenge was bringing live specimens, as I mentioned, of these cockatoos to the Spanish court. They were mostly native to Southeast Asia and Australia. Their route to Spain was one of the longest overseas, actually. Most of the animals exported from Asia to Spain during the 16th and 17th century left from the Philippines, which had been under Spanish rule since 1565. To reach Spain, these animals had to cross the Pacific Ocean. They would disembark in the Pacific port of Acapulco in Mexico. Then they would cross Mexico by land. Well, they would transport them by land, and then they were shipped from the Atlantic port of Veracruz to Spain. So imagine the long journey they had to go through. But it was not only Carreno de Miranda who portrayed these curious birds. There was also a German artist called John Klosterman, who painted another dwarf holding a cockatoo when he visited Charles II on an ambassadorial trip around 1698. The presence of this cockatoo proves an ongoing interest in this species, and perhaps this could be a variety of another cockatoo. As I mentioned again, there were longevous creatures living 40 to 50 years. So I would also like to talk about precedents to this kind of portrayal of dwarfs and exotic creatures paired. And one interesting precedent is a portrait of Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia by Alonso Sánchez Coello. Isabel Clara Eugenia was actually the daughter of King Philip II, and she's next to her servant, Magdalena Ruiz, who carries two tamarins, which were monkeys found in the Portuguese territories of the Amazons, which I must recall was under Spanish control. The Portuguese territories were under Spanish control between 1580 to 1640, actually, because the Spanish and the Portuguese crowns united during that period. So here we see a whole kind of portrayal of empire again, and even more so because he has tons of pearls decorating her elaborate dress, which were, many of them were brought actually from Colombia in these regions. So moving on, And returning to Micol, apart from the exotic cockatoos, there were also two small dogs. The dog on the left stands on his hind legs, or maybe perhaps he's performing a trick or begging for food, as we see dogs do. X-rays revealed that the position of the tail of the dog to the left was altered. This dog has been identified as a spaniel, which were a typical small dog breed at the Spanish court during this time. Meanwhile, the dog on the right seems a bit indistinct, almost puppet-like. Perhaps Juan Carreno de Miranda had a greater interest in the cockatoos, no? Because they were more unusual and courtly portrayals. Apart from the animals, we see the still life, no? With the pomegranates and grapes, which are prominently featured. The pomegranate was also incorporated into the coat of arms of the Spanish Catholic monarchs after the Christian conquest of Granada in 1492, which was the last Iberian territory under Muslim rule. The pomegranate could thus have these royal connotations. It could equally have religious connotations, as it often featured in scenes of the Virgin and Child, as did grapes, alluding to Christ's blood and his future sacrifice for mankind. Meanwhile, there are also goldfinches, which are two of them of which are in mid-flight, which are often also associated with the passion of Christ, as the red mark on their head was said to come from one of the drops of blood from Christ's crown of thorns. Also, goldfinches eat thistles, which are symbolized by the crown of thorns. So there could have been these double Christian and royal allusions in this portrait. And I think, sorry for the quality of this image, but perhaps Micol might have been portrayed by another artist called Juan van Kessel, who was active in the Spanish court as royal portraitist for a while. And what is curious is that unlike Carreno, he chose one of the biggest dog breeds. He chose a Mastiff, as we saw in Las Meninas. So he's kind of emphasizing how small the dwarfs were, no? There was this other intention here. And what is interesting, sorry, it's not very clear, but just between the supposedly Micol portrait, his legs, between his legs, there's an inscription that says that he was 22 years old at the time. Unfortunately, there's no indication of what this sitter's name was. So we're not certain 100% that it was him, but he certainly wears a very similar attire and has a similar hairdo. And also a facial expression is quite similar as well. Apart from Micol, Carreno de Miranda also portrayed other dwarfs such as Antonio Maccarelli and Nicholas Jobson, whose portraits are unfortunately now lost, but there are some survivals of court jesters such as Francisco Bazán and Eugenia Martínez Vallejo, who was portrayed both dressed and in the nude. And what is curious is Carreno really makes an effort to paint them in a dignified manner, overlooking the pejorative descriptions circulating about Bazán's lunacy and Eugenia's weight. So this is something that he will carry from Velazquez, from this tradition of really dignifying the sitter, no? And now turning to Velazquez, as I mentioned, of course, the most prominent exponent of this type of portrait, the court jester portrait, was Velazquez. As I mentioned, he really consciously made sure that they were confident sitters. He revealed their small stature, but really emphasized their role in the court. beyond being entertainers. Some of them had prominent roles. For example, in this portrait, we have this sitter who is looking at some books, perhaps account books, or he's dealing with administrative matters. His identity remains anonymous, as recent technical research has discarded the popular identification of him as Primo, jester of Philip IV. So this is up for debate still. But hopefully we will be able to discover his identity soon. And he painted another 7 of these portraits, usually in front of landscapes or kind of monochrome backgrounds, so as not to detract from the sitter and the strong personality he conveyed. These portraits were usually placed in palace rooms devoted to the amusement and non-essential tasks. For example, in the 1930s, these portraits were even assigned to one particular room, called the Room of the Jesters, next to the Queen's Room in the Buen Retiro Palace. So in conclusion, setting them and having looked at our Mr. Micol in context, I would say that he kind of encapsulates the court of Charles II as a court of entertainment and luxury. In 1700, Charles II passed away with no descendants, marking the end of the Habsburg dynasty. For me, Micol hints towards this luxurious decadence. He stares at us with a sorrowful expression, as if aware of what is about to come. Well, thank you very much for joining, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Akemi, thank you so very much. That was wonderful. I will give everyone just a moment to get questions into the chat box. And as you do that, I will let you know that you'll have an opportunity to hear from Akemi again. She will be one of the featured speakers in our upcoming Curator's Choice Spanish Art in Britain and Ireland course. That course begins on Monday, so you still have time to register, and I will paste a link. But I will wait for any questions in the chat box.
I'll just add that some of the great collections of Spanish art in the UK that Akemi mentioned earlier on will be represented in that lecture series, as will Akemi herself, of course. So Wallace Collection, for example, and the National Gallery that Akemi will be talking about. So just another plug.
Okay, Akemi, the questions are coming in now. So it sounds like we have some people anxious to pick up a book that they want you to publish on Zerberon. So curious about when that will be published.
Let her finish her thesis.
I know. Step by step.
Oh, yes. Okay, so Lourdes is curious if Carreno signed his paintings.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Do you know if Carreno signed his artworks? Did he sign his paintings?
Yes, he did in some instances, but more royal portraits and less so, let's say, in his earlier career, or for example, in more of the jester portraits, so it varied. And there was also an incredible corpus of drawings. I cannot emphasize how many there are, especially from his early period. These are not signed in most cases because these are normally kind of studies for or preparatory models, which they would show to the patron before undertaking the commission.
Thank you. Barbara is wondering if you could repeat what you shared about the small dog on the right in this painting.
Yeah, so it has been said that it's a Cocker Spaniel, although it's kind of up to debate because the dogs, especially the one on the left, is quite sketchily painted. Now, apparently there have been some x-rays taken, and the tail of the one on, sorry, you were asking about the one on the right or the left? Now I'm getting...
the one on the right. think the
On the
black
right.
and
Sorry. So then the one on the right, I think is kind of a bit puppet-like. I wouldn't say that's a Cocker Spaniel, or wouldn't pin down a certain breed in a way, but you're more than welcome to guess. Some of them, I feel that the dog, especially on the right, is quite sketchily done if compared to, for example, the cockatoos that are quite elaborate.
All right, we have 2 more questions. This one is from Howard. Howard notes that Carreno appears to have an affinity for other personalities and other in quotes in court life. So Howard is wondering if this is something that the interest came from the artist, or was he requested to create these portraits by the king or Mariana?
So there was certainly an interest, and as I mentioned with Velazquez already, and there was a stipulation in many instances where they wanted portrayals of these court jesters. As I said, there was even a room devoted to them in the Buen Retiro Palace. So there was a real interest for these portraits in a way, and sometimes they were used in more playful backgrounds, no, where kind of close to feminine quarters or the children's quarters. They were seen as festive, kind of very lively compositions in a way. And they were kind of contrasted with the more somber kind of courtly portraits. But sometimes they also came together. So sometimes the rulers, as we saw with Isabel Clara Eugenia, I can show her again, wanted to be portrayed with their court gestures. Here, even though it seems like it's dominating her gesture on her head, it's also endearing. She talked a lot about her. She had great esteem for Magdalena Ruiz, actually. And they, as I mentioned, they accompanied them to many kind of public events, such as festivities, court trials, etc.
Okay. Yolanda is curious if once once one of the dwarves passed away, would they be given kind of a special burial, a special place to rest?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that, but I would imagine they are giving a proper send-off, given that they were highly esteemed at the court, and they would basically be at the court throughout the extent of their life. As we can see with Magdalena Ruiz, she's more of an elderly jester now. So it is quite interesting. Those that stayed within the court definitely attain a prominent status, but then unfortunately there were also cases, as I mentioned, where they did not adapt and they were sent back to these hospitals they were taken from, and there were 2 main hospitals in Zaragoza and in Toledo, Spain, apparently, where they were, many of these persons were sought in a way.
Okay, and this will be our final question. Lourdes is wondering about Carreno's frescoes, about the location.
So there are several locations, but he worked a lot in Toledo Cathedral, for example, and he also worked on commissions for frescoes that were not undertaken in Madrid, for example. He did the preparatory drawings, but did not follow through. Sometimes he even did oil sketches in preparation for them. So there were several stages for that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Akemi. I want to thank everyone for joining us this Thursday morning. And Akemi, we could not be more thrilled to have you join us here at the Meadows Museum in our offices next Monday. Thank you so much for the talk, and we look forward to having you for the next year.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining.